So I'm Isabel, and I'm from Centrally, and I'm talking today with Ruth Ramsay. She's a sex educator and coach with a TEDx talk that's received over 2 million views on YouTube, which is pretty cool. So hi Ruth, I'm
Hi
really
there.
happy to be talking to you today. What's the biggest thing you wish people understood more about sex?
That it should be a source of joy and pleasure and not of shame.
In your coaching, what would you say is your mission?
The recognition of sexual energy as a force for good, not a force of shame. And obviously, what you're doing with Sensually is all about that as well. It's about saying let's kind of open the lid on all of this stuff and bring it into the light and enjoy it and appreciate all of the huge range of positives that comes from openly exploring one's sexual self. Running up to this interview, I was thinking, what is my role within the Sensually site? The role that I would like to play is in helping people be ready for new experiences, because we can all think, oh, I want to try a threesome. I want to go to a sex party. I want to try BDSM. I want to book a sex worker. But the way to then go ahead whilst maximizing the chances that things are going to be safe, enjoyable, you're going to get what you want from it, that it's going to be a fabulous experience, is actually to put a bit of work in first about thinking, why do I want to do this? What needs am I, or curiosities am I looking to get served through this? Because it's not necessarily how it might appear on the surface with exploring fantasies, for example, but what do I truly want from this? And then what steps can I take to make sure, or make it as likely as possible, that I'm going to get what I want from it? So as a coach on Sensually, that's what I would like to bring to the platform, helping people go through those processes to make sure their new experiences are safe and pleasurable. Do you know, I do a workshop called Your First Sex Party, and that gets incredible reviews. People will write to me saying, oh my God, we went to Killing Kittens last night and it was amazing, and it wouldn't have been without your workshop. We were saying all the things that would have gone wrong if we hadn't have put the time and thought and preparation in to making sure that it didn't go wrong, you know. So that's something that I'd love to bring to Sensually. The other thing that I do aside from coaching, though, is striptease lessons. I've always loved teaching striptease. I hadn't anticipated that becoming a coach would enable me to carry on teaching, but I found people were asking me, basically. I was finding that sometimes in a coaching journey, if a client was still struggling to connect with themselves on a deep level, a striptease lesson, actual movement rather than talking, and connecting through movement would unlock something. And so now that's something else that I do, and I still absolutely love it. And it's the transformation that I love, and the moment when I see someone relax into their body and think, actually, I can do this, and this is going to be fun. That's my favorite moment, and it gets amazing results just from one striptease lesson in people's confidence, connection with their bodies, sense of playfulness and fun around it as well. So I do that online, and sometimes I teach in person in London as well.
And how did you get into this world? If you don't mind telling us a little bit more about you and your journey into the world.
Well, I'll try to keep it relatively brief. I had a fantasy when I was a small girl of being a striptease artist, which I think came from watching the dancing girls at the start of James Bond films and things like that. So I had this fantasy, but never thought it could become a reality. I went to an all-girls school. I never had a boyfriend despite desperately wanting one, wasn't kissed till I was 18, but still had this fantasy of being a striptease artist. Instead, I worked hard at school and I did a journalism degree. At the time, it was the top journalism degree in the country. This is in the mid-90s, and went into journalism and was working away and wasn't entirely happy, but felt I should be. I was working as a fashion business journalist. It was glamorous. There was travel, etc., etc. But when I saw an advert for London School of Striptease a few years into that, I thought, this could be interesting. And I didn't realistically think at that point that it would mean I packed in the journalism and became a full-time stripper. But that's actually what happened. So I signed up for classes at the London School of Striptease. It was brand new at the time. I did a beginner's course, an intermediate course, and within a month of that intermediate course, I was auditioning at the White Horse strip pub, RIP, in Shoreditch. And then from there, I had about a year where I stripped part-time and kept the journalism day job. But eventually, I just loved the stripping so much in all sorts of ways. I was already getting involved in activism around sexual rights, being asked to write people when they knew I had a journalism background. Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you write me this article? Because I was paying tax and hadn't kept it secret from anyone, I had certain privileges being English, stepping into the industry. I was very out with everybody. I was declaring as self-employed, so I could be a spokesperson for a lot of workers who weren't in that privileged position. And within a year, I'd quit the day job and become a full-time striptease artist. So I did that for 12 years. During that time, I was active in setting up what was at the time the first sex workers union in the UK. I worked with lots of charities. I danced all over London, a little bit internationally as well. I started teaching striptease very early on because I had felt the power of it myself. And I was modeling, and then I was running striptease events myself with friends. Had an amazing time with that. But then eventually the kind of venues that I loved dancing at were closing down with gentrification of East London. I was getting into my late 30s and thinking, oh, it's probably be sensible to start thinking about training in something else. And then I met my now husband, and to be with him meant moving out of London. So all of that kind of collided. And so I moved out of London. I trained to be a personal fitness trainer because I thought it's quite similar actually to striptease. You're on your feet all the time. You're kind of sexy. There's music on. But more than that, you are in a very intimate situation with your client very quickly. And I like that. You know, I'm not someone who wants to stand by a water cooler chit-chatting about the weather. I like to get in there and be intimate. So I was doing that. I launched my own PT studio, but in my heart, I was still a striptease artist, and I grieved losing that work. And about once a year, I'd get out my suitcase of all my old costumes and things, and I'd think, right, I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to keep a couple of favorite things. And I'd end up just sitting on the floor crying, surrounded by all my outfits, and they'd all go back in the suitcase. The suitcase would go back under the bed. But in that period of time, my main focus was on creating a happy step family. So not only had I moved out of London, but I'd become a stepmom, which was a total shock to kids for whom it was not age appropriate to know, hey, stepmom was a stripper, let alone one of London's top strippers. And so for the first time in my life, I was keeping that secret, which was incredibly hard. And it was a tough few years, but eventually it got to the point where my stepkids were old enough to know, and we had a good enough bond. And we're great, great friends now. They're in their mid-20s. And they were going off to uni, and I allowed myself to feel how deeply I was missing working in the sexy world. By that point, I no longer wanted to go back to stripping, and I was still living out of the city. And by this point, I was early 40s, and the mainstream industry isn't welcoming generally to people beyond late 30s. So I was thinking, well, is there a way to get back into the sexy industries? And I trained as a life coach, not realizing that would be my route in. But actually, that's what it turned out to be. So after I'd qualified, someone who knew my past, who'd actually been on the same diploma as me, coaching diploma, contacted me and said, would you coach me about my sex life? She said, I feel so much shame around sex. I've got all of these fantasies and curiosities I've had since my teens that I've never explored. It always feels that sex has been about a partner's pleasure. But I can't talk about it with anybody. I feel so much shame and embarrassment. But because I know about your past, I feel that you're not going to slut shame me. You're not going to judge me. you're the only person I can think of. I can't even talk to my husband, but I feel I could talk to you. Can you combine that with what we've learnt on this coaching diploma and coach me around sex? So that was the light bulb moment. And that was about 4.5 years ago now. And so then since then, I've been building my business as a sex coach.
Wow, that's crazy. The fact that she only felt that she could speak to you and not your husband just shows how much it's needed. Like, this kind of thing is needed.
Absolutely. And I do hear that kind of thing all the time. I can't talk to anybody, but because of your background, I can talk to you. So when I was training to be a coach, a life coach, we were told, don't tell your client anything about you. Minimize personal stuff you put on social media. You need to be, in your coaching, holding up a mirror to them, for them to see themselves and understand themselves better. And if you're sharing personal information about yourself and stuff, that can kind of get a bit messy. But what I found when I started coaching around sex was that the more I shared about myself, where relevant to the client, actually, the more comfortable they felt about opening up. So say if, for example, from what they were saying, I had a strong suspicion that they'd faked orgasms for a long time, I might mention that I had, because that was part of my sexual history. And as soon as you say that, oh, that makes me feel so much better. And then people open up. And yes, people will come to me and say, because of the stripping, the modeling, I did some dominatrix work. I'm involved in the kink world now, and I'm quite out about that. People will say, because of this, I feel that I can talk to you in a way that I couldn't talk to a standard coach.
I think it's hard sometimes to separate your personality and your personal
Yeah.
experience job. Like, kind of is human to do that.
One of the concerns with coaching where you have personal experience is that you will put your own experience onto the client. So my experience of the world of kink is this, therefore the client's experience will be this. That's one of the concerns. So that's something that I try to be very mindful of. But again, the fact that I'm involved in certain worlds makes people a lot more comfortable. So clients, a couple I'm coaching at the moment, they weren't sure whether they needed coaching or therapy. And there's an important distinction between those things, but they'd had a few discovery calls with therapists and then with a couple of other coaches as well. But they said none of them is actually actively involved like you are, Ruth. And we feel that you will understand us because of that. It's not a theoretical thing. You actually have the current up-to-date lived experience. And so that's why we've chosen you. So I think there is value to having that experience, definitely.
How would you describe your approach to what you do in a nutshell, kind of your style of coaching and stuff?
My style of coaching is upbeat and pleasure-led. So rather than focusing on what's been going wrong, where do you feel let down, where are you not getting pleasure, I start from the point of what does feel good, and let's have a positive outlook. Very often people aren't talking about sex with anybody, but if they are talking about sex, it's to worry, to complain, and to dwell on the negatives. And instead, I think it's good to be upbeat and positive about it. And part of that is kind of opening our eyes to how we can treat it like other areas of life. You know, it's not just in a separate box aside from everything else. So people will say, I'm exhausted. I've got 3 kids under 6. I've got a stressful job. My mum's ill. My husband and I argue all the time. I'm coming to you because something's wrong with me. I never feel like sex. And I'm like, of course you never feel like sex with all of that. But we seem to think our libido should exist in this separate magical box where it's just always there, ready. And it isn't. It's a part of life. Sex is a part of life like anything else. And actually, when we recognize that, I think it can be very positive as well.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, it's often put in that weird space, and it's just a bit like your TED talk. It's kind of more.
Yeah.
Why do you like coaching, or would you say that like there's your favorite thing about it?
My favorite thing about coaching is how quickly it can work. Literally within one session with someone, I will see their body language change, their facial expression change. Very often people just need permission to think about sex in a different kind of way. And also they've built up so much fear and worry around talking about it. I'm not too harsh on people who are late to sessions or even do a no-show for their first session, because it can be kind of such a source of terror almost. And I might get a message in response to my, hey, you didn't show up for our session today, is everything all right? I might get a session a week later saying, I couldn't, but I do want to try again. Sometimes I'll have discovery calls with people, and it might be a few months, or in one case it was a year before the person called back and said, it's taken me this long to build up the courage, but I want to do this. So I'm very accustomed at the start of a first call to someone being sometimes even visibly quite anxious, but it's so quick that people relax.
What should more people know about coaching?
Well, I wish people knew what it was, first of all. So sometimes I have messages from people who assume I'm like a football coach or a tennis coach, that I'm going to be, sometimes assume I'll be physically there with them, giving them tips and pointers and no, up a bit, down a bit, and giving them lots of physical exercises to do to increase their sexual stamina or something like that. So that's a misconception. I'm not like a football coach. Sometimes people assume it's therapy. So therapists and counsellors help people deal with unresolved trauma from the past. So if something is holding you back from being able to fully kind of inhabit and enjoy your sexual life, then you need coaching or therapy. Whereas if it's a case of nothing's holding me back, I just don't know what I want, I need to explore that, I need to broaden my beliefs around what sex can be, or I'm curious about something on the Sensually platform, so I'm curious about kink, or about opening up my relationship, or about new experiences, and I need some help to understand what I want and what the safe action steps are towards that. That's what coaching is. But people struggle to kind of understand how that will help with sex. I think we're not accustomed to investing in our sex lives in an educational way. We are also brainwashed by what we see on TV. People are very quick to point at porn and say, oh, it's all porn's fault that people have bad sex lives. But what's presented in the mainstream as sexy and normal and how sex should be, I think is just as damaging as what we see in porn. But people don't realize that, people think, it's also the people I speak to, so many clients, intelligent, worldly, experienced people, have still believed everything they see on mainstream TV. I don't understand why I'm not turned on instantly. My husband touches me. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with the marriage? As I said in the example earlier, people will list off so many sources of stress and demands on their life and then say, but there's something wrong with me because I don't spontaneously want sex. There's something wrong with me because I don't orgasm in missionary position in 3 minutes, for example. And so what I wish people knew generally about sex is that what we see on mainstream is a load of rubbish. And what I wish I understood about coaching is how quickly it can help them reframe that.
How has your relationship with the coaching and what you do evolved over time?
Well, when I started out, I started as a coach, thinking I'd build my business as a coach. But what I'd vastly underestimated was people's lack of education around sex. Back in my stripping years, as I've mentioned, I was doing all sorts of other stuff. And one of my jobs was reviewing books about sex for a magazine. So I read a lot of stuff. And that was my own personal sex education at that point, of realizing how little I knew. But I'd kind of forgotten that in the mainstream, people generally don't know this stuff either. So I would be coaching someone and not realize that they didn't know the fundamentals of their own anatomy, for example. So very quickly I realized, okay, there's education that needs to be done before people are ready for coaching. And then the other thing that I'd underestimated was how difficult people find it to talk about sex. Because having been a striptease artist, I was talking about sex in the dressing room with the other dancers. I was talking about sex with the audience. I mean, I spent my life talking about sex for about 12 years, and I'd underestimated how hard people find that. So whereas I launched as a coach and thought I'd be doing one-to-one sessions, what I ended up doing quite quickly was going more into the education space for adults, and putting together a course. So if you told me at the start, a year from now, you're going to be launching your first online course, I would have said, oh, no way, that's too soon. But I found that people needed something they could engage with anonymously, but that also gave them an opportunity to apply what they were learning to themselves. Because it's one thing watching a documentary, listening to a podcast, reading a book, but the power comes when you are given the time and space and the right questions. And ultimately, coaching is asking the right questions to understand on a deep level, how does what I've just learned apply to me in my unique life? Because you can listen to a podcast and 40-year-old man who's only ever had one partner can listen to a podcast, and a 25-year-old young mum who wants her sex life back can listen to the same podcast, but the action points, how it applies to your lives, and the action points you can take from that, of course, are unique. And so I came up with the Passionate program, which is my 8-week online course, which is education, but then with workbooks with questions in, guided by my questions as well during the presentations, to help you apply what you've learnt uniquely to you and create your own action steps for positive change. So that happened very quickly. And then I started doing webinars as well. So I've got a whole suite of webinars now. How to Please a Woman in Bed, which is also called How to Pleasure a Pussy, Understanding Your Erotic Mind, How to Feel Confident Naked. I've got one on consent, one on jealousy, one on communication, because people like to have that kind of easy entry point. So started off as a coach, very quickly went more into educating, and now I'm becoming better known. I'm finding that the coaching business is increasing again.
Who would you say is like your typical client, or how varied is it? And how do they benefit from your sessions?
Well, my typical client for one-to-one coaching is actually one half of a couple. So it's been fascinating over the past 4.5 years since I started to kind of see how it's developed. And what tends to happen is that if we're thinking heterosexual couples, which typically it is, it will be either the woman or the man. People are always surprised, actually, that my clients aren't all women, but one half of the couple will book a discovery call with me and will say, our sex life is non-existent, disappointing, boring, whatever it might be, and I want it to change. And my partner's not quite as on board with that as me, or possibly I haven't spoken to my partner about it, but I know I want things to change, and I'm prepared to invest time and effort into making that happen. And then typically I'll coach just that partner, actually. Sometimes it then turns into couples coaching. Sometimes right from the start, it's a couple. But very often it's just one half of the couple. And what I always do is take them on a journey about themselves first, because until we understand who we are sexually, where our beliefs and influences have come from, what we've been taking as gospel from mainstream media that we shouldn't, once we understand ourselves, then we can bring that into the relationship. And as I'm sharing with them various coaching exercises, research, educational stuff, which I'll share outside of the talking sessions, typically within a few weeks, they'll be like, I had no idea what I didn't know. And I'll encourage them, feel free to share things with your partner. So if there's a particular exercise that's made you go, wow, this has taught me so much about myself, share it with them as well. And as I say, sometimes that then turns into couples coaching, but sometimes it just stays with that one partner, but the transformation is then in the relationship overall. And my best thing is when I get an email from the partner saying, I just had to reach out to you and say thank you so much. So that's typical for the private coaching. And then for the course, the Passionate program, it tends to be individuals who want to learn and explore more about their sex lives, and couples who have been able to say to each other, things have got a bit boring, haven't they? Let's do something about this. That tends to be couples in their 30s, maybe early 40s. And I absolutely love it when they've been able to be honest like that and say, instead of stopping talking about it, stopping having sex, let's make this our new project together. And again, the TEDx talk has created a lot of that kind of business as well. And so for people like that, they're not necessarily wanting to spend the money and the time on one-to-one coaching, but the course is perfect for them because they're learning, they're applying it to themselves as well. They can reach out to me at any time during the course. It's not a buy it and you never hear from me kind of course. It's a kind of hybrid pre-recorded live kind of thing, so people feel they're on this supported journey, and yeah, that gets incredible results as well.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine that it's at least, like, at its least, it's probably just so good just to have the conversation opened.
Yeah, one of my top tips for beginning to talk about sex in your relationship, if you haven't before, is to find a kind of third party or bit of content to talk about. So couples watching the TED talk who've reached out and said, we've never spoken about sex. It's been like, we would never have dreamt of sitting down one evening and saying, right, let's talk to each other about our sex life. No way. But to sit together, looking at the telly and then talking about what you had proposed, let's treat sex as a hobby, has enabled them to do that. So read a book, listen to a podcast, watch a TED talk, and then discuss that thing as the opening point for starting to discuss your sex life.
Is there one piece of advice that you give out that you feel has been effective for you personally in the past?
If it's personal about sex, I think my number one piece of advice, be it about sex or about business or anything, is to trust your instinct. So the older I get, I can look back and every time instinct said, this isn't a good idea, or instinct said, this doesn't look like a good idea on paper, but it's a great idea, do it. Every time my instinct was right. Definitely. Trust your instinct, follow your instinct. Be sensible around safety if instinct is leading you down a path that doesn't seem sensible necessarily. But fundamentally, yeah, trust your instinct because it's always right.
And how do you feel about sex in society today?
I think in a lot of ways we're moving forward with sex in society. So I've talked about the terrible representation of sex on mainstream TV and film, but I think that is improving. We are seeing a lot more understanding of and acceptance of diversity. Certainly just within the time that I've been coaching, I think there's been a lot more acceptance that in order to have a good sex life, you don't have to be between the ages of 18 and 38 and look a certain way and be able-bodied, etc., etc. I'm not met with as much shock when I talk about coaching people in their 60s, for example, or coaching people with disabilities. I'm not met with as much shock as I was. But having said all of that, I need to be constantly aware that I live in a kind of sex positivity bubble. The people I'm following on Instagram, the kind of films or TV I will choose to watch, all leans towards sex positivity and diversity. Occasionally, I will kind of get a shock when faced with someone who isn't within that sex positive bubble, and then that reminds me that there's still a lot of work to do. And if we look at what's happening in the States, for example, around abortion rights, trans rights, all of the stuff that's happening there. I think we all need to be very, very aware that in some ways things are going backwards. And absolutely do play our parts and do what we can, which includes, for example, filling in government consultations. There's one on porn. I think the deadline has just passed for that. But basically, if you care about sexual freedom, do try and be aware of what's going on politically and do try and get involved, because all too easily, all the freedoms that we've won could disappear again.
What are your hopes for the future in the sensual world with coaching, but also in any other realm? Is there anything that you hope to do still?
My hope with the coaching is to kind of carry on the momentum that has been building with the TEDx talk and stuff, of getting the word out there. And I'm very aware and pleased and proud that it's not just me doing this. There are some amazing sex educators out there now, some others of whom are on the Sensually platform. And I hope that between all of us, we can spread the message. I mean, I think all of them would agree with my message of let's have sexual energy respected as a positive force for good. And I think going forward to just carry on being part of that and helping as many people as I possibly can. And something I always say at the end of my webinars, at the end of my course, is always, please take the top thing that you've learned from this, or the thing that surprised you most, or the thing that you most wish you'd known 10 years ago, and share it with somebody else. You know, if we can all talk more about sex, you know, we should all be part of lifting the shame about sex. And then I guess thinking about the impact of that longer term is that for kids growing up now and teens now, that they kind of enter adulthood far better equipped around consent, boundaries, knowing their own bodies and knowing their own wonderful capacity for pleasure, much better equipped to go and enjoy that in a healthy and safe way.